Welcome to Hacking HR and welcome to this panel for Hacking HR's October series. As we have the other panelists join us online, let me introduce myself. I'm Peter Searcy. I'm one of the panelists, temporarily filling in for Minnow Lejac, who's our amazing moderator today. I'm a senior executive with the FBI, currently in finance, and super happy to be here today. So if we can get the other panelists on. The October series has been great so far. It's been a great start to the month. And today, the power of vulnerability, fostering authentic connections and innovation in corporate culture. I'm sure we will have an amazing conversation. So if you don't mind, let's just go around the horn and we will ask everybody to introduce themselves, tell us who you are and where you're from. And then we'll go from there. And then hopefully Manola will be able to join us and she can take the reins as she so aptly does all the time. So Christy, can we start with you?
Sure. My name is Christy Doucette. Yes, I'm Cajun. I'm from South Louisiana, born and raised. I am the Vice President of Talent for Advantage Capital in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I've been in HR for probably about almost 20 years.
Awesome. Lisa?
Hi, good morning. I'm Lisa Nareski. I'm the Director of Talent Strategy at NAV in the FinTech space. I have been in HR probably about 20 years ago or so myself. I live right in the Philadelphia suburbs, so a little bit chillier than where Christy's calling in today. And a cautionary tale that after 3 years of COVID, we can still get a cold. So apologies in advance for my voice a little cracky this morning. I'm fighting a little bit of a cold. But hey, it's not COVID. So there's that.
That's it. And Salvador.
Thank you. Well, very nice to meet you. I'm a senior HR digital transformation leader at IBM. I'm a little warmer right now in Mexico City, still enjoying summer weather. So very happy to be here. And I've been in HR for about 15 years already. So happy to be in this panel.
Perfect. And though normally I'm in Washington, D.C., in my non-work life, I help run a writer's workshop every year in the fall. So I'm actually on Martha's Vineyard this week, taking time out from my writer's workshop that I help run to be here with you all. So I'm enjoying the cool Martha's Vineyard fall. So it's been great so far. So I kind of want to start, the whole idea of this panel is vulnerability, authenticity, and how that connects to innovation, right? So we are supposing the premise is that you must be vulnerable to be authentic in order to innovate. So let's start with the first half. Why do we have to be vulnerable, and what does that? I would guess let's focus on that authenticity piece, and maybe what does that mean to you, especially if you're in a leadership position, to be vulnerable. What does that mean to you, and maybe why it's important. So let's sort of start there, and then we'll tackle the innovation connection in the back half. So Lisa, can we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Pick on the sick person first. Why not?
Yeah, let's get you up front so your voice is still okay.
Get me running, right? Absolutely. So when I think about the space of vulnerability and I think about the space of connection, kind of before the place of innovation, I kind of think about it as taking us down to taking away all masks, taking away all preconceived notions or everything that's maybe been built up, and taking us to scratch where we can maybe start over from a place of building those relationships and building those pieces. As HR professionals, when I preparing for this call this morning, I think about all of the places where we're often asked to kind of show up in a situation that's already been maybe escalated, or there's already perceptions, or we come into a relationship or a situation where there's already some backstory. And so often we have to go into that, with a certain hat, or playing a certain character. And so as I think about, the conversation today, and I think about how we show up differently, I think that this is a really important space for us to talk through. How do we build those authentic connections? How do we get rid of some of those prescribed personas that maybe we already come to the table with mirroring and some of that background conversation. So that way we can start from scratch and we can come to a place of innovation.
Salvador, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think related to that, I when I think about vulnerability, sorry, I think about trust, and trust is about this secret ingredient, right? That gets people together and helps on the relationships between humans, between organizations. So, and one way of developing and creating this trust is by being, open, being transparent, being candid, being vulnerable, because that way you build this trust that is the secret ingredient I'm talking about. So when you share context within your communication, when you share vulnerability in your communication and your relationship with others, I think you're in your way to really build this culture of trust where anything can happen. People trust each other, people work along each other better, they support each other, and this is the place I want to work in, right? This is where people can come together with their best ideas and without failure, a fear of failure.
Yeah, I love that you sort of brought trust as a center tent pole to the table of this conversation, right? Really, really sort of like this core baseline, need that we all have to work through in the office. Christy, what about you?
Gosh, those are hard things to follow. When I think of vulnerability, it is trust. It's all these pieces. It's also reminding us we're all humans, right? So I think we sit there, we get these big job titles or degrees and these things behind our names, and then people forget that you're just a human being, and that's how you simply start building that piece of it. It breaks down walls, it breaks down assumptions. It helps you as well, because I know when I'm vulnerable, it reminds me that there's stories that other people have that I can learn from them. And that does ultimately lead to that trust piece and building and leadership. You have to have it. If you do not have that trust, you're not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I think I love what you said, and I think to build on kind of what Lisa started to say, we sort of put on these hats or we play these roles at work, and that's a way of protecting ourselves. Like, let's say we're in a leadership position, we're the boss. Sometimes we don't know what we're doing, like we're figuring it out, and so we fall back on the role. Like, okay, well, I can be the manager, I can be the HR person, I can be the director, and certain tenets of behavior that people assume about the role, I can do that. And then that sort of formulaic behavior kind of guides me in times when I don't really know what to do. But the more we, I think, Lisa, to your point, like the more we fall into those behaviors, then we become less of our real person, sort of as Christy and Salvador, you sort of talked about. And, we're in a power dynamic at work. Usually, if we're in a leadership role, if we don't show vulnerability first, they're never going to be vulnerable to us. They're like, hey, show us your 100% real self. I'm holding myself back, but you be real. But I'm going to be this faceless monolith, right? So talk about, I guess I want to, like, if you have an example or your sort of experience with that idea of like in the leadership role, or when you're in the power dynamic that's definitely inequitable and you're in the more powerful position, like how can you show vulnerability as like an offering, to the group to sort of be like, hey, it's okay. We, to your point, like we are real people, but kind of like give us some ideas of like ways to do that.
I think one of the ways is just opening up your shortcomings to other people. One of my things I always say is I do not like public speaking. So when I go to do a presentation in front of all our employees, it's always that awkward, look, I'm just as nervous, if not more nervous than you are standing up here. I may have this information, but gosh, all these eyes looking at me, I can barely breathe. And it starts just those small things, saying I'm not great at this, helps people to realize, okay, maybe I can have these conversations. And people want to think that vulnerability is giving these great big stories. I think it really, really starts very, very small and then builds to that over time.
Lisa, Salvador.
Yeah, I think also I love your example, Christian. I think vulnerability sometimes gets confused with weakness, and it's not that, right? When you are vulnerable, it's not that you're showing that you're a weak leader. It's just you're showing that you're human and that you have the same fears, the same concerns that as any other. You're just trying to move forward. You're trying to, with this growth mindset, you're trying to challenge yourself to grow and set yourself these new goals. So I think it's very, very important when you think about vulnerability that you have permission to fail, that we are not perfect, right? And you give also your teams that permission to fail, because if they feel that comfort, if they feel that level of safety, psychological safety, as we have spoken before, this is the environment that you want to build. Of course, we don't want only to say we will only fail. We will learn from our failures, and that's, but the team should feel encouraged to innovate and tied to the topic. You cannot allow a team to innovate if you punish failures or if you
Mhm.
criticize failures. I think that's important thing. If you start with yourself, if you start showing your own vulnerability, if you share your lessons learned about what did you learn when you failed, I think that that's a great example. Sometimes when I speak to my teams, I say, well, I failed this time, and this is what I did. This is what I learned. This is how I could do it differently, or I would do it differently if I would have the same chance or the same opportunity. So it's just about going to Christy's point. I mean, this is about recognizing that we're human beings as well.
Mhm. I think sometimes it's hard for us, but to hold this sort of cognitive dissonance in our hand of I can have authority and expertise and yet acknowledge that I made a mistake. I don't know everything. There are things I'm not good at. And I think a lot of people, they struggle with that. They're like, oh, I can only have this if I have none of this. Whereas
Yeah.
I think showing both of those things at the same time and being comfortable with that, that is what real people, because that's how real people are, right? As we've said before. Lisa, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just thinking as Salvador and Christy were talking about, the intentionality of how I want to show up as a leader, right? Because it's so easy for us to kind of fall into those patterns of, we're kind of talking about asking an employee to show up differently. We want you to show up differently, but not too much. Don't make anybody uncomfortable, right? And so, but so how do we as leaders really kind of think about going into a meeting or as Christy was talking about sharing for employees to think about like, how do I want to show up differently today? How do I also want to encourage my executive team or my company leaders to show up differently, right? And be really more intentional about that. Hey, this is a story of my own experience that I want to share about how I don't particularly like talking in public, right? Or I haven't exactly done this yet, but I'm committed to figuring it out with you, right? And so how do you, I guess, set intentions for yourself about wanting to show up differently and helping to coach leaders on how they show up differently? I think about some DE and I conversations that we had, in my last role, and asking leaders to show up with specific stories that they wanted to share to show employees it is okay for us to kind of talk about these things, right? And and being intentional about asking the execs to maybe take a few minutes and prepare and really think about how they want to be vulnerable on that call and set the tone for employees to do that, because so often you're in roles and you're in jobs and you've kind of now understood, okay, this is the expectation, don't share too much, don't do too much. But when I see a leader being vulnerable, when I see a exec being vulnerable, it makes me feel like I can kind of come out behind that mask and show up differently. So I think as HR leaders, we're continued to challenge to do that in our own lives, but then also to continue to push our partners to do that too.
Yeah, I love what you said about trying to be really intentional, and let's try to get for one around. Let's try to get very tactical. So if we're talking about, hey, we all agree that vulnerability and like being a real person and showing that to your team and showing that at work is that key to authenticity, which is how we build trust. Salvador, to your very excellent point, what are some very tactical things you can do to inculcate those behaviors in your team? Like if somebody's listening in and they're like, okay, that's great, but like, can you give me some things to do? Like I could go tomorrow and I could try this, right? what are these kind of tips or your top trick or your top hack for trying to start this conversation or these behaviors that you want to see in your team, either that because you're starting or then you're trying to get them to do. So you are trying to build this relationship web of trust and authenticity within your wider group. So Christy, any thoughts on some concrete tactical type things we can do for that?
Yeah, I think really it's just admitting where your limitations or your stress is. So HR, we, especially on the higher levels, are told keep everything confidential. It's all to your chest. You gotta be wearing that extra stress on your shoulders. And I know that's one of the mistakes I've made in my career, where I have not told my employees that, the whole truth behind some of these decisions, right? Or the pieces, because we are the gatekeepers. We have to keep everything quiet. I think it starts with a simple conversation with an employee going, look, I'm trying to get this passed. I am struggling trying to get this done because certain leaders feel this way. And I, asking for their input and starting that small is saying, I am struggling with this decision, and having that conversation does a few different things. It builds that vulnerability moment that I am not the strongest person in the world. And it also gives them a chance to have some input and understanding of some of the decisions that we were making or having to do that they don't ever see behind that closed curtain.
Yeah.
Salvador?
Yeah. I think in line with that is, never bury bad news. And because I think the worst thing that can happen is that your employees and your team know about something that you didn't communicate directly, and then you start to lose credibility and loyalty even from your team. So one thing, we have to communicate bad news in many ways, and we have to do it in the most human way possible. But at the same time, we have to be assertive and tell them, the truth, and don't try, because eventually everything. Technology has made so transparent everything right now that employees will find anyway any bad news. So it's better that they hear it from us, and the way we communicate, the way we empathize with them is so important. One other thing is, I remember myself. I was running a project a few years ago, and something went wrong. And my leader at that time, I was so afraid of that meeting because he was going to just kill me and tell me everything that I did wrong. And the first thing he told me is, okay, what happened? I described the situation. And the only question he asked me is, what will you try next? So rather than, blaming everything that happened, the only question is, what will you try next to make it better, or to make it different, to make it successful? And just that reaction brought to me, okay, yes. And I was able to figure out a better way to do it. But rather than trying to defend myself, which if we would blame me on all the situation, that create me this safety to say, yes, this is what I did wrong, and this is what I could do better. And I did better, and thankfully it was successful. But just single words that I felt a caring attitude from my leader. And when he told me, what will you try next? He made me think about how can I do better, rather than trying to put myself in a defensive situation where nothing could get out of there. So, that's a specific example that.
Well, I love in that example, what he's also doing is he's taking you out of the past and he's orienting you toward the future with well, what could you try next, right? Instead of let's talk for an hour about all the things that happened in the past that were terrible. Be okay, let's look ahead. And so I think that's a great tactical option, just literally reorienting things to, okay, well, now that we're here, what do we do next, right? I think that's great. Lisa?
Yeah, I was going to say there are two that come to mind. The first one, and maybe it's an oversimplification, but I think it's worth calling out, is really just to be present, right? I think it's hard to develop any kind of authentic, vulnerable state when you're, answering a Slack message, you got something happening on your phone, you got a manager banging on your door, right? So how do I continue to, ground myself in the present and be here in this moment to like actually listen and be a part of? So I think we maybe underestimate that one a little bit in the world of all of the multi projects and tasks that we're working on at each time. So that would be maybe my first. My second is really kind of anchoring to assuming best intent. So often our experiences shape us, and we can be overly critical. And so maybe, kind of dropping that guard a bit to say, let me assume best intent when I go into this conversation or relationship or connection point, to really kind of bring forward that positivity and think about, how do you build on that from a place of, best intent.
Mm-hmm. I totally am on board with that. I think it was both Chrissy and Salvador talked about, like, you have to communicate well and often, and you can't hide bad news. I think there's sort of this, and again, I think it's because we have our HR hats on and we're thinking about risk a lot. And I think we are sometimes inured to fall into what I think is a trap of, I don't want to communicate until I 100% know the answer. It's definitely decided, whatever. And by then it's too late. So there's this narrative silence that's emerging in your team, in your organization, and people will fill narrative silence with a negative narrative if you do not supply the narrative, right? In the absence of you telling them what's happening, they're going to think, how are they screwing me over? How is this going to be terrible? And so I think filling that space with like, hey, a decision hasn't been made yet, or they're still, like, for us, our senior executives, sometimes, as you might imagine, in a very large organization, things get sort of stuck there for a while because they're really thinking about things from very different angles, which is their job. But like sometimes decisions get stuck on our executive level a lot. And so a lot of it's like, well, hey, our 7th floor is still discussing that. I know that's frustrating. I know it's been there a long time. Don't read anything into it. This is the bureau, like just even telling them like, hey, here's where it is, to go into your point, Lisa, about assuming good intent, but filling that trap of the narrative silence, trying to do that. Another thing I definitely do on my team, especially when I have either I come into a new team or I have new people come in, is I explicitly talk about how feedback is going to work as a very normal part of our day. And I try to actually give them language to use. So I'll say something like, hey, feedback is really important. That's very normal. There might be a part of the multiverse where people do not make mistakes, but like that is not where we are. So like you are definitely going to make a mistake. It is 100% going to happen. So, or you're going to do something and I want to give you feedback on it. So when that happens, I'm going to come to you and say, hey, remember that time during orientation when I said I'm going to give you feedback? This is going to be one of those times. And let me tell you a little bit about what it is. And you're going to be like, oh, okay, yes, he did say that was normal. And then I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do that. And then sidebar, I always, after I give somebody feedback, I always make sure that the next time I see them, I'm having a normal interaction with them, even if I have to like engineer it a little bit. Because I think after you give somebody feedback, they're always waiting for are they giving me the evil eye the next time they see me? And I'm like, nope, I try to like run into them at the printer or whatever. I mean, virtually that's a little harder to do. Like we're also in the office. And then also I norm that they're going to give me feedback too. And I'm like, hey, I'm open to feedback and I make mistakes too. So there's going to be a time when you're going to want to give me feedback. And so you're going to come to me and say, hey, remember you said that you can give me feedback? And I'm going to be like, yep, I said that. And I'm going to get my pen and I'm going to be like present. I'm like, okay, I'm ready to receive feedback from you. Thank you for coming and giving that to me. I know that's really hard. And then you're going to give me the feedback. So I'm literally pre-walking them through what they're going to say and how I'm going to react, so that when the time comes, I can do that and they can do that. And they sort of already have this like little script written out, because I think that's what people struggle with too. And then I'll be like, oh, and I always, especially if it's an employee, so there's a power dynamic, I always start with like, thank you for sharing that. I know that's always really hard. You're in a vulnerable position giving feedback from your boss, but I'm telling you, I really appreciate that. That is what I want you to do. I'm really going to take some time and think about it. I'm not going to then immediately go into, let me tell you why you're wrong, right? I'm always going to say like, I'm really going to think about it and then I'm going to get back to you tomorrow. I'm never going to try to answer the feedback right there. Because of course, in the back of my brain, I'm like, what are you talking about? You don't know this and blah, 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 blah. This is why, like, of course, because like, that's what we're all doing. But like, none of that is helpful, even though that's our first instinct. So you always stop yourself and be like, hey, let me ponder it. Let me go talk to my trusted people and knock that around a little bit, and then let me really think about what the right answer is to do. Awesome, great tactical tips, everybody. We talked a lot about that authenticity and trying to create these moments of trust and these workspaces where we can bring, let's say, a greater percentage of our true selves to work, even though we're probably not all like 100% ourselves. But if we're like the 80% or 85%, that's great, right? Is there a danger of becoming too casual, or is there like a danger, like if we could swing the pendulum to an unprofessionalism side? Has anybody ever had that where you're like trying to like, no, you can be yourself, and you're like, ooh, not that much, like is there a danger there? Does anybody have that experience?
We still need you to wear pants, right? I mean, I guess is that the bar, right? Like we want you to show up authentically, but we still need you to wear pants, right? Like, so I think it's like, how do you create an organization where, you're showing up as your authentic self, but you're also kind of, maybe not creating a space where other people feel uncomfortable, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the bar, right? Of like, especially when we've had, so in my last role, we had employees all across the country that were very spread out. We had folks who came to the table with many different backgrounds, cultures, religion, political views, all of those things, right? And so I think what we've tried to do is to ask people to show up as their authentic self, but to also show up as an ally first, right? And create that space of, we want you to be yourself, but we also want you to think about how do you create space for other people to be comfortable as well. And so when that authentic space kind of borders on making someone else feel uncomfortable, I think that's the place where, we as leaders in the organization have to help people kind of understand what that balance is, that we still need you to wear pants kind of place, right? And so we try to anchor it first to ask people how we want them to show up, showing up first as an ally. And even though I don't understand your story, or even though your experience is different than mine, I support you, right? And so kind of putting that spin on it first.
I love that as a piece of practical advice, as sort of a spin, because I think we've all had the employee who is, we would say, like overly blunt or rude to the point of unprofessionalism, and they're like, well, I mean, that's just how I am, like that's just my personality, I'm just gonna tell you like it is. I'm like, okay, but like maybe you don't have to use those words to tell it like it is, like, because that's actually kind of, that might be authentic, but maybe that's not okay, so I love that frame to put around it as, hey, we're going to show up and be an ally first and really make this space. And then within that space, we want you to be as authentic as you can be. I think that's an awesome way to think about it. Christy, Salvador, any thoughts on that? The authenticity versus professionalism, teeter-totter?
I do, and you were already touching on this. A lot of people associate vulnerability with all these emotions. It isn't, it isn't. I think it's control over your emotions more than anything. So it is reminding yourself in a professional environment, when something gets too emotional, you realize that as a leader, stop, pause, like you're saying, and take a breath. And that's like what I advise a lot of our employees. I've had employees sometimes, especially I find in the last few years, things are just more emotionally driven in situations. And I will advise them, before you send that email, before you respond to the situation, I want you to go home and I want you to go to sleep. And come back tomorrow, and we're going to have this conversation again, because I think you're going to come with it through a different lens. It's not telling people not to be vulnerable. It's just, you need to regulate your own personal emotions, because those can cloud your judgment very quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this concept of allyship is so important, because, I mean, some of the attendees are saying, that your freedom ends where somebody else's freedoms begin. And that's so true, because that's where you put the boundaries, right? And you have to set the boundaries based on respect, based on empathy as well. I mean, you may have situations where, even employees with mental health challenges, and you have to be very, very sensitive to those situations, but also not only for that employee, but for the remaining employees of the team, right? So that's why I think that balance is sometimes delicate balance, but definitely the allyship concept, and we do a lot of training in how to become an ally in many different diverse groups, because we want to ensure that that happens, and respect at the end, it's what should be the cornerstone of every relationship here. And so I very much agree with this concept of putting the boundaries and setting these ally mentality in our teams.
Yeah, so let's I've seen a couple people say, and I'm sure you've all been on panels who have heard some version of this comment, which is an oldie but goodie, which is like, that's great and all if you're the leader, but what if you're not the leader and you're in an organization that doesn't have that? What do I do? So let's flip it around and let's talk about either our own experiences or our strategies for when we enter a group that is not like that. Like, it's whatever kind of mess it is, and we're now in the non-powerful position, or we're mentoring up maybe to our boss, and we're having to try to inculcate that attitude or that behavior, or try to create a better environment from the non-power position. Are there strategies, are there tips you can use to do that, where maybe you're going a little bit more against the culture flow, or just not not a tradition of vulnerability? I know, the FBI is very conservative, right? And I mean, there's amazing leaders in the Bureau, but it's not traditionally always been a touchy-feely place. The Bureau is really trying to, diversify and really bring our leadership into a really great sensibility now, and we're doing an amazing job. But I think that, especially when we talk about like vulnerability, there's always this, you need to have a successful leader, successful in the organization, show vulnerability, because that shows you can still show vulnerability and be successful, right? And so even if I'm in a lower level position, I do try to share even with my new boss, right? Or my new person. Let's say I'm in a group where I am dependent on them to get my stuff done, right? Like I'm in wooing mode, right? Like I am the beggar with, proverbial project hat in hand, being like, hey, can I get some of your people project time, whatever resources? Yeah, I still feel like you can show vulnerability as a way to show that you understand what it's like to be in a difficult situation. You understand and empathize what it's like to have a very full plate and have people come and ask for more, which I'm doing now, right? So I think if you can empathize with that and show that empathy of their situation, that would sort of gets the wedge in the door, at least a little bit. That's kind of how I would recommend we start. Lisa, Christy, Salvador, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a complete introvert. I think I mentioned that earlier. I don't like public speaking, and when I started off my career, I say it always starts at home more than anything, and even outside the workplace. So I started testing a lot of this stuff with people that I already trust and have those relationships with. I get their feedback, right, because it's easier to handle and take on, because you have those relationships, that trust already built. And that helps you gauge the way to leading that into the workforce. And so you start off small. You start at home. You start practicing. You doing your vulnerability with your spouse, your friends, whoever you have that very strong, trusted relationship with. That person can also be very honest with you, and you can take that. Then you start the workforce with some coworkers. Usually, I say your friends, and you have those moments of time where you open up to them and have that vulnerability. And then I'd also tell you, as in the workplace, you're watching other people. Just like you're saying, if I see someone else doing it, if the leadership's not supporting it, then I take it as my job to go support people who are being vulnerable. And if I purposely see it, it's my responsibility at any level to go and tell that person, thank you for doing that. Thank you for being open. Thank you for actually sharing this, because this needed to be said. And we appreciate that. And that helps kind of build off of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, now we talk a lot about this candid feedback concept, right? Which sometimes it's easy to say, give or receive candid feedback, but at the end we are humans, right? At the end, as we are saying, so sometimes giving candid feedback, of course, doesn't have to be rude. Of course, it doesn't mean that. It means that you are assertive, that you communicate a point, but you are very you have a positive intent on giving this feedback to somebody, or even receiving the feedback. Sometimes when we receive feedback as humans, we may tend to be defensive, but also it makes you grow. I mean, they say, of course, that that feedback is a gift, and it's true. It's just sometimes it's hard to give it, sometimes it's hard to receive it. Uh, but that gives you an opportunity. That's a growth opportunity, definitely,
Mhm.
in both ways, giving it or receiving it. And it's a
Yeah,
practice. It's a behavior. It's a practice that you need to practice.
I love that you said it's hard to receive feedback sometimes, and even just to acknowledge that, because I think we often talk about like, oh, we should be giving feedback, and feedback is great, and whatever, which all of it is true, but that doesn't mean it's not hard, right? Like, um, we've all gotten that feedback that was really hard to hear. And I think somebody in the chat was talking about I think whether it was Christy or Lisa talked about like it's not just your emotions, it's controlling your emotions and being aware of your emotions and not lashing out in that minute and just being like, okay, I have this tornado of feelings. Let me just like hold on for a second and like keep my mouth shut and like just not blurt something out and let me try to put something in place to give myself that distance where I can like take that time, that can process, and then I can really think about it and acknowledge that it's hard. And just acknowledge when you're saying that, hey, I know this is tough to hear. I know this was not really the feedback you were hoping for. That's okay. But but then looking to Salvador's earlier point, like pointing them toward the future and be like, hey, but like okay, going forward, like what do we think is the right answer there? Lisa, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I love the place of continuing to push and move the team into the future, right? I think each of us in the space that we can control, you can be the change that you want to see in your org, right? You can be the positive voice. You can be the futuristic outlook, right? And I've worked in, different teams and different organizations where maybe the leadership wasn't bought in, but you have this team that is really supportive of each other and helping to develop and push each other and encourage each other in different ways, right? And so you can make those pockets just by starting small and starting with how you show up. How do I personally provide support for my coworkers? How do I personally practice emotional intelligence every day? How do I personally control my attitude and how that impacts other people that I sit with or that I work with virtually, right? And so I think it's just kind of starting small in the space of setting your intentions of how you want to show up and thinking about how you contribute to the culture. And I get that every culture isn't going to be amazing and that maybe leaders aren't bought in, but how do you push that change that you want to see and build and foster those relationships? Because I guarantee that once people see you showing up that way, you're going to attract other people who want to partner, want to be a feedback partner, want to help more move the organization differently. And so you just kind of attract that and you kind of get this group of people around you and you start to see that change, and it feels really cool because you don't have to be a manager to be a leader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to. Oh, go ahead. Did somebody?
No.
Okay. I want to pull on the thread you said there about like if other leaders are not bought in. I think one thing we often do as HR leaders or as leaders in the organization, because we're in a place where it's our job to know this stuff and it's our job to be thinking about this kind of thing all the time. And a lot of other leaders maybe aren't thinking about this all the time because they're worried about the quarterly report or this sales team performance or whatever. We talked a little bit about like now that this idea of like authenticity, vulnerability, trust, and the connection to innovation, right? And so I want to pivot a little bit and talk about like, okay, how are we making that case? I mean, I think sometimes for us it seems obvious, but like, let's say that you have, a leader in the organization that's come to you for advice, or you're struggling, or you're in a position where you're peer mentoring, and like you're trying to make that case for them on the connection, like this follows from this. How do we make that connection for people? How do we talk about that link between vulnerability and a culture of authenticity, and that drives innovation in the organization? So Salvador, can I ask you to start on that?
Sure. So I think it's related to these concepts about trust, psychological safety, where people can feel free to fail fast, learn fast, course correct, and then try again. Uh, and 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 that comes from the leader. I mean, you as a leader have to instill that culture and that environment in your own teams. If you promote that, then people will not be afraid of trying new things. People will, come up with new ideas. They will stretch themselves because they know that you will have their back if they fail. And I think that feeling is second to none. That you have your leaders back, that you can try, you can experiment, you can fail, as I said earlier, and that feeling can entice this behavior that we want to create in our organizations, right? Innovation, new ideas, curiosity, and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, Christy?
Yeah, I was thinking about too when you're working with a leader who's maybe kind of trying to think about how to move something forward. Usually I try to understand, where they are and what's the baseline. And I'm always kind of curious around like, what's the cadence that they talk to their team and what is their team saying, right? And so I kind of think about from a place of like, where do we start as, how are you engaging your team in these conversations to move it forward? So like, when you're having a one-on-one with your team and you're asking them, other than the work, right? How are you talking to them about the environment and the culture and what kind of team we have and how do we push it forward versus, hey, here are the list of things that we need to do or get done. Here's, what you're doing great at, and here's where there's opportunities. But having really more connected conversations, I think it's easier to start there, right? Because it's one-on-one. Maybe there's less at stake than having a big, proclamation in front of the whole company to change something. But you're just kind of asking the team and trying to engage the team differently. Tell me a little bit about how we could make this better. Do people feel comfortable sharing their opinions? Why or why not? Do you feel comfortable being, authentic in this team, and why or why not? Or what could we do to change some of these things? And so maybe just, kind of asking some different questions and starting off small, because we have a lot of great ideas. We put a lot of steam and we're going to put it on a PowerPoint and proclaim it. But actually, like, how do we get buy-in from people? In a place that we understand how we're showing up now, and how do we make those like incremental changes so it feels more authentic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love what you said about the conversations. And I know sometimes it can be a little fraught. I think we've all had that person who, struggles to give their own opinion, and so sometimes if the supervisor is asking, hey, how do you feel about, like, do you feel safe to offer opinion? I think another thing you can do is draw on them for their expertise as a very tenured person or a new person or somebody comes from a different team and say, hey, based on the place you're being tabled, what's your thought about the rest of the team? What's your thought about the rest of the group? Do you feel like they receive feedback well? Do you feel like they're in a place, even just that pronoun shift when you're talking to them sometimes, and like, that's where you sort of know your people. Sometimes you want to form that connection with that person. You want to get to them directly, but sometimes we all have those people where you're like, that's too much pressure for them in this conversation, but they'll often be more willing to put themselves over here with you and talk about the rest of the group there, from which you can, of course, infer that's how they're feeling too. But like, it's just easy. Sometimes it's easier to talk about if it's when I think about the team, they feel like this, or I'm not sure, but maybe they feel this way. And so that definitely sometimes helps if you're just having that person struggle with that. Christy?
I think you've all kind of really touched on its curiosity in my mind. And I've learned this, it was a podcast a few years ago, and it really taught me a whole lot. It reminded me of my background in psychology. Really, everyone knows the answers to the questions. They really do. They come to you, but they already know that. It's our job, I feel sometimes, a leader, just to ask the right questions to them and twist it around to where they are answering their own problem. They don't even realize they're doing it, but as they're talking it out, they are. So it's, if your leader is coming to you and saying, hey, I got this employee I'm having issues. Okay, well, let's think about this. If you were that employee and you had done this behavior, how, give me your feedback, what you thought in this situation, and start twisting the questions around to where they are seeing it from different perspectives and then outlining it as they go. And you'll see the little light bulb go off going, oh, this is what I should do. Yes. And they feel more bought into it because they actually basically came up with it. You just guided them into that direction.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, so it can't be an HR talk if we don't talk about data and measurement. I feel like it's contractually obligated for us to have some part of that conversation. And so, again, Christy, I want to start back with you. How do we know if we're doing a good job? Like, are there things that we can measure? Is there data that we can look at? I mean, sometimes these kinds of things are a little bit more abstract, maybe touchy-feely, maybe emotional, because we've said that word before. But like, are there ways that we can measure and we can think about our success? Are there ways we can benchmark and anchor ourselves? And like, I was doing worse and now I'm doing better, or I was in a better place and somehow it's worse. And like, how do we sort of think about that? I don't have any great ideas on that front, so I would love actually to get some great ideas from anybody else for sure. So Christy, would love to start with you.
Absolutely. I actually am strangely a metrics person in HR. I love this kind of stuff. I always start with when I initially build out scorecards for our teams, right? And you build out your lead and your lag measures to figure out and finding out what those pieces are. So like if I want to measure employee engagement, that's my lag measure. Of course, I got to find all the leads that are going to lead up to this, absenteeism, all those pieces that you start benchmarking. From that standpoint, when you start making these changes, so that time and point, so you can hopefully see some trends in the data if things are starting to move in the way that you want. Also, being an industrial organizational psychologist, that backside of me starts thinking of, okay, can I go even further where I find I made a particular change in this area? Where can I possibly look at correlations and run a statistical model to see, is this actually correlated and maybe having some cause or some piece of effect on this? You don't have to be a scientist to figure this out. You don't even have to have that background. It's starting to just learn Excel and Google. So if you've never done it before, Google HR scorecards and lead and lag measures, and it will start explaining everything to you. Because a lot of times in HR, some of us don't look at that metrics, but it is there and it's open for anyone to go and see.
I think that's a good topic for another talk. You'll have to teach a class for everybody who wants to learn those.
Yeah, agreed. Lisa, Salvador, any thoughts on how do we know if we're doing a good job creating this culture of authenticity, these place of psychological safety, being vulnerable?
Yeah.
Well, I think what we use this engagement survey where we have and ask very pointed questions about: do you trust your team? Do you feel that you can innovate? Do you feel that you can you have the resources that you need based on the team support? And at the end, you care about the outcomes, right? So if you start to get and you get to the objectives that you set yourself at the beginning, that means that the team is working. I don't think we can build a direct correlation for that part, but the engagement survey gives you a very good pulse of how your team feels in terms of your role and your job in building this environment of trust and vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. I love that you said, let's keep it anchored on the outcomes, because I think sometimes, going back to the conversation, we're trying to like convince other leaders, like, hey, maybe this is an approach you could take, there's often this like, well, that's just very touchy-feely, and we're here for the business goals or whatever. And I'm like, no, this is about the business goals. Like, take off the let's be nice hat. Like, we're not even talking about that. Let's just be pure Machiavelli. What is the best thing we can do to drive the business forward and either make money or accomplish our goals, whatever? And the reality is, this is that. Like, this is the best thing we can do to drive those business goals forward, to make our money or achieve our objectives or whatever. So I love that you said, but let's measure all this, but like, if it's not moving the outcomes that we're trying to do, then it doesn't really matter. Lisa?
But sorry,
go ahead.
But it starts with the employee, right? That's what this formula, EX equals CX, right? In that order, employee experience equals client
The customer
experience, right?
client
The
experience,
customer
yeah.
experience. So if we start with the employee first, I think we're on our path to success.
Yeah, 100%. Lisa?
Yeah, I think engagement and retention, right? I think of those two pieces to kind of help us know
Mhm.
um, how people feel overall about an organization. I think engagement certainly through your net promoter scores or your pulsing or your surveys, but I also think about kind of some of the ways that teams interact, right? If you're having a day of connection and belonging, or you're having some kind of town hall meeting and no one submits questions, right? Or no one wants to raise their hand and go. Some of those things, it's not a scientific measurement, but it's something that we need to pay
It's
attention.
definitely telling you something,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There's something in detective work, we call that a clue, right? So
Yeah.
you have to kind of stay in touch with some of the clues. I think also, in places, I mean, certainly people will leave, right? And you see those upticks in retention, and you try to diagnose from there sometimes, as opposed to seeing it early on from an engagement perspective. But I think in joining a team and joining an organization, looking at retention is something that is helpful in thinking about that. I also think about how employees move within the organization. Are they bought in? Are they applying for additional roles or responsibilities? Are we a culture that promotes people and hires from within? I think that's also an important kind of metric around how do employees feel, right? Do they feel like they can take on additional responsibilities and have the opportunity to expand and maybe fail in a new role, right? Or are they just kind of, okay, I haven't gotten fired yet, so I'm just going to stay here forever? So I think all of those are important for us to kind of think about. What are our employees telling us? How do they feel?
Hmm. Yeah, great point. I think Renee in the comments talks about um, look to your emotional culture, the emotions and feelings that the employees experience. You can track and measure your emotional culture as well. And I think to the point that we've said here, like, how are you feeling about how do you trust your colleagues? Do you trust your supervisor? Do you feel like you can receive feedback? Do you feel like you can give feedback? Do you feel like you're in a place where you can make suggestions? Sometimes we can have, very pointed, um, questions on these pulse surveys, and they really can tell us a lot about it. And I think it's important for us to remember, and for also to, again, going back to the trap of narrative silence, right? We have to tell our employees that, hey, we're asking you these questions, and this is why we're asking, right? This is what we hope to learn from these questions. I think you have to be, I think going back to Lisa, maybe what you said at the very beginning, we have to be very explicit about our intent and talk about it. Like, we are trying to develop a culture of innovation and you work backwards. We are trying to do this. Therefore, we have to talk about psychological safety. Therefore, we have to be vulnerable. Therefore, we have to talk about trust. And you just kind of like work back. But like you can lay that out for them, as well. And I think you do have to do that. Because for us, and I think because either whether it's because we're in HR, because this is kind of what we do, like that stream is so obvious to us. Like you can be like, oh, trust, and we're like, boom, trust and innovation. Like we're making that connection. We're like 37 steps down the road. But I don't think maybe every employee is always right there, right? And so I think we do need to be more explicit about those kinds of things. I do want. Okay, so we've had a really great conversation, and we are getting close to the end of the hour. So I do want to kind of go around once for some final thoughts. And I guess, like again, a lot of our folks in the audience, they are in places either they're trying to lead their teams, they're trying to figure out what they can do to create an atmosphere of authenticity, and because they're trying to drive innovation. So I guess, even though we talked about tactics and we talked about strategy, I guess what's the one thing you would, if they only have a Post-it this big and they only have room for one note and they've been waiting to write it, what's the one thing you hope they write on their Post-it as they take away from this session that you would be like, no, this is what I want you to take home from this session. So Christy, can we start with you?
Oh boy, no pressure. I think the biggest piece to me is just the one thing I learned in my last piece of being a leader is really being more open about some of the struggles that I am facing within the organization with my people. I think that could have changed the course of a lot of actions had I just been a little bit more open and honest on that piece.
About both, making sure they understand what's happening, right? And then also showing that vulnerability, but also cluing them into like how things work sometimes, right? And that's great advice. That's great advice. Salvador?
I would say listen to your employees. I learn a lot from what they have to say. I try to put myself with that attitude, not trying to respond to the questions immediately, but really actually listen to what they have to tell, because that gives me the opportunity to fix and realign what could be wrong with the team. So I would say a lot of listening.
Lisa, what about you?
Peter, I love the piece where you're kind of talking about, standing in the future and kind of working our way backwards and kind of thinking about all of the pieces that are going to be really important for us to stand in that future. And I think, maybe the word that kind of stands out to me as we're thinking about that we talked a little bit about earlier was the piece of being intentional, right? Like the intentionality that, while we're in this space, our leaders and maybe our teams are not always going to be thinking through the lens of, connection and vulnerability. And so we need to be kind of intentional with how we're asking leaders to show up, or what we're asking people to, what we want them to take away, or, that we want them to be present. And so I think it's just not assuming that someone else is taking it on, right? Not assuming that people know how to do it, but really, taking the time to share and to be intentional.
Yeah, great point there. And I think we talked a lot about being more intentional and being more explicit about what we're trying to accomplish, right? I was actually getting ready to give my final thought, and then Rashid from the comments came in the clutch with basically what I was going to say, which is like, if you want to have an environment of trust, you can't be two-faced about it, right? You can't say something to your team and then trash them in an email, or say something to your team and then go say something else in a conversation with another team or another supervisor or whatever. Because I know we know this, but like sometimes it bears reminding, like the world is very small and people are going, like, information wants to be free and it wants to get to your ears, especially if you don't want them to hear it. It's going to get there. And so you just have to be really, again, going to be intentional, but you just have to be consistent. And like, you can't be two-faced about it, and that this goes to your being your authentic self, right? Where is that line about like, this is where my authenticity meets professionalism and I'm going to do this. And, if you really feel like you just have to vent about some employee, like that's where you like go home and you talk to your partner, your spouse, or your trusted friend who has no connection to your company whatsoever. And you're like, okay, I'm pulling down the cone of silence and I gotta like get it out. And we all need that sometimes, but like, you can't do it at the company, because like they will. And then once you have that reputation of, oh, that's the kind of person who they walk in your office and after how's the weather, they're trash talking somebody else, because the minute they leave, you're asking, well, how often do they trash talk me when they go to somebody else's office? Like, and you're there, and then all of a sudden it's all falling apart. So I would just say, like, really try to be consistent and be thoughtful and present yourself as you are all the time in your written communication, in your emails, in your texts, in your hallway conversations, in your deliberate group meeting conversations, because that will just serve you well. It'll just be a better experience all around. Awesome. Well, this has been an amazing hour of conversation. I'm sorry, Manola, who is supposed to be our moderator, was not able to join us today. But Christy, Lisa, and Salvador, thank you so much for joining us for like just a great chat. I think everybody is on LinkedIn, so audience, you can probably reach out to us there. And usually we love to continue these conversations online. So please feel free to reach out. So for everybody joining in, thank you for joining the Hacking HR Labs October series. Obviously, we're just getting started. Way more to come, and we're already sort of planning the November series of lectures and panels right now. So just lots and lots of great conversations to be had. So have a great rest of your day, and thank you all for taking time out to join us today for this conversation about vulnerability, authenticity, innovation. All right, thanks,
Awesome.
everybody.
Thanks. Thanks, Peter, for jumping in. You did an awesome job. Future is a
Oh
modern.
yeah, no worries, no worries. Happy
Thank
to
you,
do that.
guys.
Great job. Thank you.
All
Nice
right,
meeting
thanks,
you all.
guys.
Bye. Thank you.